On Wednesday, August 5th, 2026, China's Ministry of Commerce put out a short, dry, bureaucratic-sounding statement, the kind of document that normally gets read by trade lawyers and nobody else. But buried inside that statement was one of the sharpest moves Beijing has made against Washington in years. And it wasn't aimed at soybeans or semiconductors or rare earths, the usual suspects in this fight. It was aimed at drones. Specifically, at the flow of drones, drone components, and drone-related technology from China into the United States. And if you understand just how dependent America's drone ecosystem actually is on Chinese manufacturing, you start to understand why people are calling this the moment Xi hit Trump exactly where it hurts. Let's set the scene first, because this didn't come out of nowhere. Back in May, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump met in Beijing, and by most accounts it went well, at least by the standards of the last 2 years. The two men talked about fostering what officials on both sides described as a stable, constructive strategic relationship. There was a genuine sense going into the summer that the worst of the trade war might be behind both countries, that a truce reached the previous October after a bruising stretch of tariffs and counter-tariffs might actually hold. Xi is even expected to travel to the United States next month, in September, for a follow-up meeting with Trump, a visit that, on paper, suggests both governments still see enough value in the relationship to keep talking. But underneath that diplomatic surface, the friction never really went away. And in the days before August 5th, it flared up hard. The trigger, according to China's Commerce Ministry, was a combination of moves out of Washington. First, the Federal Communications Commission's ban on certain foreign-made robots and power inverters, an extension of a broader campaign the FCC has been running against Chinese-made hardware it considers a national security risk. Second, and this one carries real symbolic weight, the Department of Homeland Security's decision to add more than 40 Chinese companies, 43 to be exact, to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act entity list. That list exists to block imports of goods made using forced labor tied to the Xinjiang region, and every time Washington adds names to it, Beijing treats it as a direct affront, not just an economic measure but a political one, tied to a subject China considers absolutely non-negotiable. China's response, when it came, was structured as a four-part package, and reporting has laid it out with a fair amount of precision. The centerpiece, the part that's gotten the most attention, is the drone measure, officially announcement number 34 of 2026. Here's what it actually does, because the details matter more than the headlines suggest. It doesn't ban drone exports to the United States outright. What it does is take drones, along with their key components and related technologies, specifically the ones already sitting on China's dual-use export control list, items that have both civilian and military applications, and subject every single shipment of those items headed to the U.S. to strict individual, case-by-case government review. And crucially, the announcement states plainly that these shipments will no longer be eligible for what's called license facilitation, essentially the streamlined, fast-tracked approval process that normally lets routine commercial exports move quickly. Strip that away, and every drone part crossing from a Chinese factory to an American buyer now has to clear a slower, more uncertain, more discretionary approval process, one where Beijing effectively holds a lever it can tighten or loosen at will, without ever having to call it a ban. That's the genius of the move, if you want to call it that. It's not dramatic enough to look like a full economic declaration of war, but it's disruptive enough to inject real uncertainty into supply chains that American drone companies, retailers, farmers, infrastructure inspectors, and public safety agencies have quietly come to depend on for years. Trade analysts describe this as a calibrated response, deliberately restrained on paper, deliberately powerful in practice, because of exactly where China chose to aim it. And that's the second half of this story, the part that explains why drones specifically. This isn't a random sector Beijing picked because it needed to retaliate against something. China dominates the global drone supply chain to a degree that has very few parallels in any other consumer technology category. One company in particular, DJI, headquartered in Shenzhen, has built a position that industry researchers describe as almost unmatched. Estimates vary depending on the segment and the year, but they cluster around DJI controlling somewhere between 70 and 90% of the U.S. commercial and consumer drone market, with some sourcing putting its share of the American consumer segment as high as 80%. A federal advisory body, the Special Competitive Studies Project, has put DJI's global consumer drone share above 90% at points, and its share of the broader global drone sector at close to 70%. In the public safety world specifically, the numbers are even starker. A 2021 survey of airborne response teams found over 90% of public safety agencies flying DJI drones, climbing past 92% among law enforcement units specifically. Separate reporting has found that from 2010 through 2022, roughly 85% of the drones purchased by American state agencies were made in China. Sit with that for a second. This is not a niche hobbyist product category. Drones inspect power lines and pipelines. They're used in search and rescue operations, in agriculture, in disaster response by police departments and fire departments across the country. And for the vast majority of American organizations using them, the hardware, or at least critical components inside the hardware, whether it's flight controllers, sensors, batteries, or communication links, has been coming from Chinese manufacturers, largely DJI, along with smaller players like Autel Robotics and Xage. Analysts have pointed out something uncomfortable about this dependency, which is that every civilian drone platform has a rough military analog. The same categories of components that DJI sells to an American farmer spraying crops are, in broad technical terms, the same categories of components that matter on a modern battlefield. Ukraine's war has made that painfully obvious to military planners everywhere. Drone warfare isn't a side story anymore, it's central to how conflicts are being fought. And a supply chain that runs disproportionately through a strategic rival is not a comfortable place for the U.S. military and its contractors to be sitting. Washington has known this for a while, and it's been trying in fits and starts to do something about it. Back in December of 2025, the FCC announced a ban on new foreign-made drones, adding Chinese-made unmanned aircraft systems and their critical components to what's called its covered list, a designation reserved for equipment the government considers an unacceptable national security risk. The agency pointed specifically to the risk of large-scale attacks at major public gatherings, citing the 2026 World Cup and the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics as events where the stakes of a compromised drone supply chain suddenly become very concrete. That ban blocked new Chinese drones and components from receiving the equipment authorizations they need to be legally sold or imported in the U.S., though it didn't touch products already in the field. There was supposed to be a second, arguably more consequential step. The Commerce Department had been working on its own set of restrictions, ones that would have gone after the underlying technology inside drones, regardless of whose brand name was stamped on the outside. A measure specifically designed to close the loophole where Chinese components get relabeled or assembled through shell arrangements to dodge country of origin restrictions. That rule was sent to the White House for review back in October, and then in January of this year it was quietly withdrawn. Reporting at the time tied the decision directly to the broader diplomatic thaw with Beijing, suggesting the Trump administration pulled back from the more aggressive Commerce Department action specifically to avoid antagonizing Xi ahead of what was, at that point, a carefully managed reset in the relationship. In other words, Washington had a tool available that could have seriously damaged DJI's position in the American market, and it chose not to use it, at least for the moment, in favor of keeping the diplomatic track alive. That's part of what makes this August moment so pointed. China's drone export controls are landing at a time when the American side of this relationship has been oscillating between hawkish restriction and cautious diplomacy, and Beijing's countermeasure effectively says, "We notice, and we're not going to just sit still while you build leverage against our biggest tech export in this category." The drone measure wasn't the whole package either. On the same day, China's Commerce Ministry added 6 American entities to its own countermeasures list, a designation that bars Chinese companies and individuals from doing business with them. The named organizations include Applied DNA Sciences and the non-governmental group Human Rights in China, both accused by Beijing of assisting American sanctions tied to Xinjiang. Separately, China banned a company called Compliance Testing LLC from doing business in the country, accusing it of working with the FCC in ways Beijing characterized as harming Chinese sovereignty and security, a reference to the compliance testing infrastructure that underpins a lot of the certification foreign electronics need to be sold in the U.S. market. Beyond that, China suspended follow-up factory inspections conducted by Chinese certification bodies, inspections that are a mandatory part of the product certification process American companies rely on when manufacturing goods in China. And it opened a national security investigation into imports of office printers and copiers, a category that might sound almost comically mundane sitting next to drones and forced labor sanctions, but which trade watchers note tends to be where China signals it's willing to keep expanding the list of sectors it's prepared to scrutinize if things escalate further. A spokesperson for the Commerce Ministry, addressing the package as a whole, argued that the recent American actions had gone against understandings reached between the two heads of state and had damaged China's legitimate interests, describing Beijing's response as necessary but restrained, and calling on Washington to walk back its own measures and return to consultations. That combination, framing the response as forced and moderate while still landing a real economic blow, is a pattern China has leaned on throughout this multi-year trade fight. It lets Beijing claim the moral high ground of restraint, while still making its point unmistakably clear. And the warning embedded in that statement matters, because more American restrictions may already be in the pipeline. Reporting citing sources familiar with the matter has described the FCC preparing a rule that would ban Chinese-made components used in data centers, a category that touches everything from networking equipment to power systems inside the facilities running America's cloud computing and AI infrastructure. Separately, the FCC has reportedly been weighing a ban on imports of new Chinese-made optical transceivers, the components that convert electrical signals into light for high-speed data transmission, another highly specific but strategically important corner of the tech supply chain. China's Commerce Ministry has been explicit that if Washington moves ahead with measures like these, it will respond with further countermeasures of its own, suggesting the drone controls announced on August 5th may turn out to be an opening move rather than a final word. So where does the American drone industry actually stand right now, caught in the middle of all this? There are real signs of movement and real signs of scrambling. Reporting from earlier this year described the Wall Street Journal uncovering talks inside the U.S. government about directly funding a small group of American drone manufacturers, potentially through equity or debt investment, an unusually direct form of industrial policy for Washington to be considering. When that report surfaced, shares of several drone-linked companies jumped sharply in pre-market trading. Florida-based Unusual Machines, notably a company with Donald Trump Jr. as an investor and board member, surged more than 30%. Other names in the space, Red Cat Holdings, Kratos Defense, Aero Group Holdings, and AeroVironment all moved higher on the same news. It's a small but telling data point about how directly political this industry has become, where a company's stock price can swing meaningfully on reports of government backing tied to the broader fight with China. There's also a parallel effort underway to build out alternative supply chains through allied countries rather than purely domestic production. The latest defense authorization legislation includes a provision, Section 1266, directing the Pentagon to co-develop drones with Taiwan, effectively granting Taiwan the kind of industrial partner status in this sector that Japan and South Korea have held for decades in other areas of defense cooperation. A Taiwanese manufacturer, Thunder Tiger, became, late last year, the first company from the island admitted to the Pentagon's Blue UAS list, the government's list of vetted, trusted drone suppliers, opening the door to federal procurement contracts. Officials involved in that effort have pointed out that cybersecurity certification remains the practical bottleneck determining which Taiwanese suppliers can actually participate at scale. But the direction of travel is clear. Washington is trying to route around Chinese dominance by building up trusted alternatives in Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Europe, and Canada, even as it simultaneously restricts the Chinese supply it still depends on in the meantime. None of these alternatives change the picture overnight, though, and that's really the uncomfortable core of this whole story. Even critics who've spent years warning about America's drone dependency on China acknowledge that this problem took 2 decades to build, through a combination of Chinese state subsidies, deep vertical integration inside China's manufacturing ecosystem, and frankly, superior products sold at prices American manufacturers structurally couldn't match. DJI didn't win the U.S. market through espionage or coercion. It won a huge share of it by making genuinely excellent drones at prices that made rational sense for farmers, filmmakers, first responders, and hobbyists year after year, while American competitors struggled to scale. That commercial success is exactly what's now being reframed as a national security liability, and it's exactly why Beijing's decision to tighten the export spigot on drone components lands as such an effective piece of leverage. It's not theoretical, it's not a future risk. It's something touching operations happening in American fields, warehouses, and emergency response units right now, this week, this month. For investors and industry watchers, the near-term read is fairly straightforward, even if the long-term picture is murkier. If Chinese drone exports genuinely start slowing under the weight of this new case-by-case review process, American businesses that rely on DJI hardware, and there are a lot of them, could face real delays getting replacement parts and higher prices when they do. That's the mechanism analysts are watching most closely in the days and weeks ahead. Less about a hard shutoff and more about friction accumulating quietly across thousands of individual transactions, each one now subject to a slower, more discretionary approval process on the Chinese side. Zoom out, and this drone episode fits into something much bigger than just unmanned aircraft. It's a live case study in how both Washington and Beijing have learned to fight this trade war using precision instead of blunt force. Nobody's talking about across-the-board tariffs shutting down entire categories of trade overnight anymore, at least not in this particular exchange. Instead, you have the United States targeting specific sectors it considers national security risks, robots, power inverters, and drones through the FCC, forced labor concerns through Homeland Security's entity list, all while simultaneously maintaining broader tariffs that, separately, have hit China and dozens of other countries this year. And you have China responding not with a mirror image, but with its own asymmetric answer, tightening the exact choke point where it holds the most leverage, drone components the American economy has spent 2 decades becoming quietly, structurally dependent on. Both governments, notably, are still talking. The Commerce Ministry's own statement explicitly called for a return to consultations rather than further escalation. Xi's planned trip to the United States next month is still, as of this moment, on the calendar. That tells you something important, that even in the middle of a countermeasure sharp enough to be described as hitting Washington where it genuinely hurts, neither side appears to want this specific dispute to collapse the broader relationship entirely. It's less an opening salvo in a new all-out trade war and more a pointed, deliberate reminder, sent right before a high-stakes summit, of exactly how much leverage Beijing still holds and exactly how uncomfortable it would be for the United States if that leverage ever got used at full strength instead of in this calibrated, case-by-case form. Whether this eases before Xi's September visit, gets folded into whatever gets negotiated when the two leaders sit down again, or instead becomes the first domino in another escalating round of measures and countermeasures, depends heavily on what Washington does next, particularly with those still pending FCC rules on data center components and optical transceivers. China has made clear it's watching those closely and has already signaled that further American restrictions will be met with further Chinese countermeasures. For now, the drone industry and the thousands of American businesses and public agencies that quietly depend on it are left doing what they've had to do repeatedly over the past 2 years, watching Washington and Beijing negotiate their broader relationship in real time and hoping the ground doesn't shift too much further beneath them before the two presidents actually sit down face to face again.